How about that for a short lesson? Made me tired. 3 years ago, the Education Committee of the Colorado Black Roundtable launched the Save Our Children Education Project. The 3 goals of the project have been to raise the level and depth of conversation regarding the education of Black children in the city and state. And we feel it's important to have a grasp of history as well as a knowledge of the current policy environment. Secondly, we wanted to begin to develop, educate, motivate, and mobilize a cadre, a critical mass of persons and organizations who have a commitment to improving the educational outcomes for African American students. And then finally, we wanted to share and compile resources for students, parents, and educators. And we've held a series of forums. Thank you for being here today, taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for what I believe is going to be a historic and long overdue conversation. With the history and experience, commitment, expertise, and activism of the folks here today, I'm certain you'll leave with plenty of food for thought and hopefully some inspiration for positive action. So what I'd like to do today, and I'm going to try to do it briefly, is to share with you how my personal journey intersects with KEYS and the struggle for equal education in Denver. Then I'd like to share my observation of issues and trends that have emerged over the last 2 decades in the post-desegregation landscape that may be contributing to our journey full circle from an intentionally segregated and unequal school district to a 21st century version of separate and unequal education. And finally, I'll suggest some things that we might want to consider as we continue the struggle. As a product of DPS and child of the civil rights era, my journey took me through Harrington Elementary, Smiley Junior High, and East High School. As a beneficiary of desegregation, I cherished my ethnically and economically diverse school experience. I'm going to tell this story because I think it really impacted where I ultimately wound up. I had a counselor who wasn't really too interested in me, even though I was taking AP courses and thought I was a decent student and pretty active. I took me to school. So I had bought the books and was on my way. But I had a group of competitive peers like Happy Haynes who were applying to colleges and doing some things. And together we sort of pushed each other, not only to excel, but to apply to college. And my trajectory from East High School took me to Princeton University instead. And I kind of wish I had gone to airline technical school because I kind of flew free and all that kind of thing. But I'm glad my journey turned out the way it did. In 1976, my husband John and I returned to Denver to raise our 3 sons. And it took involvement in the schools and persistence to ensure that they did not get lost in the system. At the middle school level, fearful of the DPS track record with Black males, we exercised our choice and enrolled them in Denver. We returned them to DPS after I was elected to the Board of Education. As a higher education administrator, I was responsible for pre-collegiate programs at Metro State College and the University of Colorado. And I got really disillusioned as I saw the unprepared students coming from DPS. As a policymaker during my 6 years as a member of the Denver Board of Education, I saw and experienced a great deal. From averting a teacher strike to hiring the first Black female superintendent, Dr. Evan Dennis, to working to achieve compliance with the court order, and it was quite a journey. Then as an academic, frustrated with the experience with the struggle for equal opportunity, I focused my PhD dissertation on KEYS. And what I learned through this history, looking at it through legal, political, and managerial lenses, helped me to understand why this era is so important and why the vision has been so elusive. We are at a point in in the continuing struggle for equal educational opportunity, at which a backward glance might be useful. In my view, there is an unsettling level of historical amnesia in the African American community, the community at large, among district leadership, reformers, and game changers. There's a gap in the public memory of the understanding of this important chapter in the history of our city and the history of our schools. And many of us today, many of us have drunk deeply from the wells of freedom and opportunity that we did not dig. And during this Black History Month, we owe it to H. Noah, Omar Blair, and Ed Garner, many others who have sacrificed much for the dream not to let this history fade. At its best, history should require us to rethink the things we think we know. The history of peace and the separate and unequal educational opportunities it was designed to remedy should challenge us. It should give us a fuller understanding of ways that ordinary people help shape the history of our city and our schools. Good history reshapes assumptions. It forces us to learn from past failures, reassess our achievements, and reimagine what is possible. In the Keys desegregation landscape, there was a maze of complex legal, political, policy, managerial, and practical issues that impeded efforts. As a researcher in policy analysis who has wrestled with multiple dimensions of school desegregation, I found that a broad view of the history and future of school desegregation requires a range of analytical lenses. Desegregation is at once a matter of constitutional law, teaching techniques, and liberal democratic ideas. Looking at desegregation through only one or some of these lenses gives a partial and distorted view. Thus, the analysis must range from the legal meaning of Brown and Keyes to community politics to patterns of suburbanization. Different lenses yield different, even contradictory images. And if we can understand these partial views and contradictions, we'll go a long way toward understanding why desegregation is still both so important, yet so difficult to achieve. As a first Northern desegregation case, he shed light on separate and unequal education in Denver. And to understand the why of Keyes, one only needs to revisit the history of public education, race, and separateness in Denver. In 1859, the first school was established in Denver that included American Indians, Mexican Americans, and Missourians. In 1860 school, the first school district in Colorado was established with the creation of what later became the Denver Public Schools. In 1866, a territorial law was passed that mandated separate schools for colored students. And let's not forget that in the early part of the 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan had a lot to say about how life would be conducted, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. There was no safe haven from racism, and Jim Crow moved right on north. And as you saw in the documentary, separateness was a way of life in the Rockies. The story of Denver's desegregation began in 1969, again when a group of parents felt that deliberate segregation had been carried out by the school board through several mechanisms, including the construction of a new elementary school in the middle of the Black community west of Park Hill, the gerrymandering of student-attended zones, and the use of so-called optional zones choice, and the excessive use of mobile classrooms. The movement for desegregation did not arise because anyone believed there was something magical about sitting next to a white student in a classroom. It was, however, based on a belief that the dominant group would keep control of the most successful schools, and that the only way to get full access to those schools would be to move toward litigation in Keyes. He's helped to shift the focus of school desegregation from the South to the country as a whole. It was the first to include Latino students as plaintiffs subject to similar segregation and unequal opportunities. It established that racially segregated actions in one portion of a school system could render the entire system liable to definition as segregated. And the case provided an excessive amount of information on just how future courts would handle segregation cases. Unfortunately, busing to achieve racial balance and other requirements of court-mandated segregation did not produce the types of results that many had hoped. African American students grew weary of being bused far from their neighborhoods, only to be resegregated within schools at the end of the bus ride, where many continued to receive unfair and inferior education. There was a sense, as Rachel Noel has said, people just didn't have their hearts in it. After the termination of court orders, school districts were declared unitary and free of all vestiges of discrimination. Once that happened, school boards were free to make decisions that had the effect of creating unequal opportunities for minority students unless civil rights lawyers could prove that school officials had intended to discriminate, a standard that is virtually impossible to meet. The history of the courts and desegregation law is thus a history of unease, uncertainty, and ambiguity. In the Keys case, the judges grappled with the distinction between de jure segregation that occurs by law and de facto segregation that happens by fact or circumstance. Segregation that emerges by fact instead of law doesn't make it right, doesn't mean it's fair, and doesn't mean it won't have consequences. Shirley Chisholm observed this distinction in a different way. She says the difference between de jure and de facto segregation is the difference between open, forthright bigotry and the shame-faced kind that works through unwritten agreements between real estate dealers, school officials, and local politicians. Once school districts are declared unitary, they have no obligation to offset de facto segregation in schools resulting from residential segregation. As the Brown and Peace cases have been commemorated, one can infer several lessons for the next 40 years as minority communities continue to try to reach their elusive promise of equal educational opportunity. First, school exclusion and isolation tactics have shifted throughout the years. As one practice is declared illegal, bad faith actors can and have shifted to rely on reported alternative rationales to secure the same result. One where the schools and the spaces minority children sit to learn every day remain separate and unequal. Since the 1970s, the courts have retreated from Brown and the intent of other cases like Keys and removed meaningful remedies to reach their promise. And so the work ahead is to try to find a new path to Keys. In 1995, Judge H of the 10th Circuit Court declared that the district had removed vestiges of discrimination to the extent practicable. And that word always bothered me, I never knew why, but practical. As a member of the board, at the end of court-ordered supervision, I really felt that there was a need to put a resolution on the table, which I did, as guidance to monitor equity in a number of areas. And I suppose this too was relocated to the archives. But Judge Mage, who had presided over the case since 1976, told the city it could abandon a 21-year-old court-supervised experiment with desegregation and forced busing and return to neighborhood schools. In his opinion, the judge observed that the new political power of Denver's Black and Hispanic populations will guarantee a fair share of public school money will be channeled to largely Black and Hispanic schools. The Denver now before this court is very different from what it was when this lawsuit began. The current mayor of Denver is black. His predecessor was Hispanic. A black woman is the superintendent of schools. Black and Hispanic men and women are in the city council, the school board, the state legislature, and other political positions. Judge Mage did not have a crystal ball. And even if he did, I don't believe he could have foresaw the impact of changing demographics, the gentrification of the core city, or the lack of political will reflected in the complacency and the disengagement of our leaders, community organizations, churches, and families in the continuing struggle for equal educational opportunity. And as a nation, there's been a massive bipartisan breakdown of political leadership on integration and equal opportunity. We got too comfortable too soon, I'm afraid. And as Dr. Dennis has observed, it's a new century and Johnny still can't breathe. What is the evidence, what are the observations that I've made about the persistence of inequality in Denver? And what are those issues that have emerged over the last 2 decades that may be contributing to a new version of separate and unequal education? In the post-desegregation landscape, we've seen a shift in demographics and declining numbers of African American students, which now is about 15% of the student body. Despite the ongoing achievement and opportunity gaps, it appears as if issues related to African American students are now only of peripheral concern. One parent has commented that it's almost like we've gone invisible. Oftentimes, we're not even at the table. And worse, some of us black folk who sit at those tables where policy related to the future of education is debated have no real connection to the community. And more often than not, they fail to share information. In the post-desegregation landscape, we've watched as quality and diverse educational programs and institutions were closed or systematically moved out of Northeast Denver community, like the School of the Arts at Cole, Montessori Adventure. And then there was a $10 million failure of the manual small school experiment that created racially identifiable schools within the building. Now, in the midst of the rhetoric of reform, choice, charters, and innovation, African American parents have expressed a growing concern that Northeast and far Northeast Denver schools have become sort of a laboratory for educational entrepreneurs and philanthropists, a test tube for the district, one in which our kids have become guinea pigs. In the post-desegregation landscape, we watched as the numbers of African American teachers continues to decline. In DPS, African American teachers account for just about 5% of the district's over 5,000 instructors. This critical shortage increases the chances of many African American students ever having a black teacher throughout their educational journey. There are fewer students being taught by adults with the same cultural understanding. And although I believe that all teachers have the potential to reach all kids, cultural competency should be at the core of teacher professional development, not an optional nice thing to do. That issues related to diverse staffing were an essential component of peace. In the post-desegregation landscape, we now have school choice. However, many feel that true choices for black, brown, and poor students are still limited. Across the nation, some are finding that choice programs lack built-in civil rights protections, public accountability, or transparency to prevent academic segregation based on race, disability, language, or poverty. There is a lack of evidence that choice itself addresses social equity, educational equity, or educational outcomes. And while geographic boundaries may no longer dictate enrollment, the boundaries imposed by poverty, like transportation, lack of information, or skills to effectively navigate a choice system, still limit choices for too many families. In the post-desegregated landscape, we can find growing opportunity gaps that occur based on access to information, special programs like Gifted and Talented or quality seats in high-performing schools. This month, in an Edit News article on disparities in gifted and talented programming in DPS, Alexander Ohms of the Donald K. Foundation observed that the gifted and talented system is imbalanced. Currently, just short of half of the students who don't qualify for free and reduced lunch meet some gifted and talented qualification. Evidence seems to suggest that many gifted and talented programs are now both geared toward and predominantly serving white middle-class families in many cities, including them. And even though dialogue about this will make people uncomfortable, we need to take a hard look in the mirror and deepen our discussion about what this data reveals. In the post-desegregation landscape, we've watched as more and more of our children are sucked into the cradle or school to prison pipeline. This urgent crisis lies at the intersection of poverty, race, and a lack of education. America's pipeline to prison is a trajectory that leads to marginalized lives, imprisonment, and premature death. Contributing to this trend are the well-documented disproportionate disciplinary actions experienced by Black and brown students. Schools discipline Black children more harshly by suspending them for behaviors, tardiness, that rarely result in suspensions for white children. And although the majority of fourth graders can't read at grade level, the state spends about 3 times as much money per prisoner as per pupil. In the post-desegregation landscape, there is growing evidence of deepening double and triple segregation by race and poverty and language in metropolitan and suburban districts throughout the nation. In 2012, the Department of Education released the Civil Rights Data Collection Report. The study suggests that opportunity gaps exist between Black and white, Latino and white students across the country. Findings in this report reveal that resegregating districts and schools across the country routinely offer Black children less rigorous curriculum that omits classes required for college admission. And if a student is lucky enough to attend a school in an upper middle or middle class neighborhood, is often taught in a hit-and-miss manner. And if a student attends a school in an area of concentrated poverty, his or her course of study often consists of worksheets, out-of-date textbooks, and more worksheets. Black students are most likely to have the lowest paid teachers with the fewest years of classroom experience, who become teachers through alternative teacher certification. The consensus of nearly 60 years of social science research on the harms of school segregation is clear. Separate remains extremely unequal. Schools of concentrated poverty and segregated minority schools are related to an array of factors that limit educational opportunities and outcomes. Now, the picture gets even gloomier when we place Denver in the context of where we are as a state. Beneath the surface of our rhetoric about educating all children is a profound lack of will to do whatever it takes to successfully educate poor children and children of color. This lack of will is clearly reflected in what is known as the Colorado paradox. Colorado ranks in the top 5 nations nationwide for the greatest number of college degree holders per capita. Yet, only 1 in 5 Colorado 9th grade students will earn a college degree, ranking the state in the bottom quartile nationally. Over the past decade, Colorado has experienced one of the greatest increases in child poverty in the nation. The state has one of the largest racial gaps in educational attainment in the country. And the state ranks 48, 49 in funding for K-12 and higher education. And if things couldn't get bad enough, there was a report issued last week, a couple of weeks ago, by the iNews Network, Rocky Mountain PBS, And there was 18 months of investigative reporting and analysis of 6 decades of data from the US Census that revealed the fact that Colorado went from a state that was by most measures more equitable than the national average to one that is less so today. Losing ground confirms what many of us have been feeling in our gut for a while. And this disturbing yet compelling portrait of Colorado tells the story of a state where Black and Latino residents are falling further behind their white counterparts, and the minority gains made during the 60s and 70s have eroded with time. Now, one step toward finding a new path to peace is through critically examining the politics of race, class, and education reform. Speaking as a former member of the Board of Education, it has become frustrating watching the politics of the traditionalists versus the reformist ideological battles of the current movement. And it's time to fully explain to the community what's exactly going on here, and let us know how we can help you get past it. It is a distraction that is keeping the district from fully addressing the urgent business at hand. Just as certain policies and practices contribute to the concentration of African American and Latino students at the bottom rungs of educational performance, other policies and practices work to ensure that high-achieving upper-middle-class white students retain their academic advantage. Institutional racism was present during the Keys era and is still very much alive in the current landscape. And until we understand the deeply racialized history of public education, not even the best policy efforts, not even the best reforms will fully address the educational achievement and opportunity gaps. Despite all our years of struggling with this, it appears that we're still tinkering around the edges of the old industrial model of education. And as the late Robert Sizemore has explained, we have been walking in circles as a nation in our attempts to develop reforms that positively impact African American access and success. She writes that school reform, as it is now, will not work because a main problem is the education of African American and Latino students. And as long as school reform measures fail to attack the main pillars of structural racism, African Americans and many others will not be successful. So long as Black people tolerate the least qualified teachers, the fewest resources, the worst facilities, inadequate supplies and books, a curriculum that denies the existence of Black people, their heritage, and their history, school reform will fail. The first step in producing quality schooling for all is to have candid discussions that link the inequalities of the past and the conditions of the present. Until we do that, we'll continue to spin our wheels, wondering why 40 years after Keys and 40 years after today, that schools are still separate and unequal. Secondly, there's a need to work more comprehensively and effectively with community to address the anatomy of equal opportunity. And there's a handout in your packet that goes into detail as to what that is. And if we want to get to the heart of the matter and make reform really count, we need to address how opportunity gaps are constructed. We spend enormous energy on discussions about how to close achievement gaps. Much less attention, however, is paid to the opportunity gaps, the accumulated differences in access to key resources, expert teachers, personalized instruction, high quality curriculum opportunities, good educational materials, etc. According to Linda Darling Hammond, there are 5 factors that create the major building block of unequal and inadequate educational outcomes in the U.S. First, the high level of poverty and low level of social supports for low-income children's health and welfare, including their early learning opportunities, the unequal allocation of school resources, providing high-quality teachers and teaching to all children in all communities, the rationing of high-quality curriculums and track and inter-school disparities. The struggle for equal educational opportunity today requires that we fight both for equity and we fight for educational excellence. Even though equity is held up as one of the core values of the district, sometimes it's difficult to see how equity is being realized and played out in policies and practices and reform efforts. The pursuit of equity and excellence in education will require building greater levels of trust and collaboration between families, communities, schools, foundations, and other governmental organizations. And as an African American community, we must share our fair share of the responsibility for the failure of our schools and our children. We must reignite the commitment to educational excellence. It means that we must find a way to re-engage our parents and help them more effectively navigate the educational pipeline. It means that our community organizations and churches have to find a way to support educational excellence, and it does take a village. And as Eddie would say, the preachers are the only ones who can tell parents that go to hell if they don't treat their children. It means that reading and math literacy must become more important in our homes than how our children perform in sports. It means working to change the culture of negative peer pressure so that smart, being an academically excellent student becomes the new standard for coolness or hipness or whatever they call it these days, instead of how low their pants are hanging. It means prioritizing our children's future by creating a community that nourishes student achievement. In finding a new path to peace, we must foster schools that build the society our changing population needs if it is to flourish. Ultimately, all of this comes down to deciding what kind of society we want to live in and the legacy we want to leave our children and our children's children. We have to ask ourselves honestly today if we even value diversity, if we see a need to address racial and economic isolation in our schools, or we can just do nothing, quietly accept separateness and inequality as the reality of everyday life in the modern world. But in doing that, we must understand that we're giving up on the dream, that we're placing our students at a global advantage by raising and educating them in isolation. There's much that needs to be done. It is our hope that as we revisit the history of Keys and the struggle for equal educational opportunity in Denver, it will help us learn from past failures, reassess our achievements, reimagine what is possible. 30 years ago, in a prophetic dissent in Milligan versus Bradley, Justice Thurgood Marshall reminded the nation of what was and what is still at stake in the fight for desegregation. He writes that we deal here with the right of all children, whatever their race, to an equal start in life and to an equal opportunity to reach their full potential as citizens. These children who have been denied the right in the past deserve better than to see fences thrown up to deny them that right in the future. Our nation, I fear, will be ill-served by the court's refusal to remedy separate and unequal education. For unless our children learn to live together, there is little hope that our people will ever